Well, my name is Roy. I'm an alcoholic. My sobriety date is July 8th of 2003. And I'm going to tell you so you don't have to do the math. That's 16 years and 2 months. And the reason I say that is because when other people give their sobriety date, I'm busy trying to figure out how long they've been sober, and I don't hear the rest of what they say. So I thought I would save you the time. It's not my first time sober. I'd also like to say that I am very appreciative to be asked to speak here. I'm very humbled by it. And I think they've done a tremendous job. This has been an amazing experience for me. My ego draws two pitfalls for me. And the first one is thinking I am better than. And the second one is thinking I'm much worse than. And so I have spent the last few months going from I am going to be the most spectacular AA speaker ever. You're going to be repeating stuff I say in meetings for generations to come, to it is going to be such a mess, I'm never going to be able to show my face in AA again. The good news is I know it'll probably lie somewhere between the two, and it's all good. I don't know exactly what's going to come out tonight, but I do have one story. And so I will tell some part of that. I have to spend quite a bit of time on what it was like, my first step, the powerlessness and the unmanageability, because in order to make the rest of my story make sense, anyway, it's an important part. My story starts the day I was born. I was born and I was really messed up at birth. I had a hole in my diaphragm, which is the muscle that separates the lower stomach cavity from the chest. And so all my internal organs were up in my chest, and they were grown together. And I was very sick. This was in February of 1963. And at that point in time, medical science had not progressed much. So the doctors told my parents to let nature take back its mistake, and that they would just let me die and move on. And my dad did not buy that. He was a very aggressive man. As a matter of fact, he was the warden of a prison, and he had decided to take me out of the hospital and drive to Colorado Springs. It was a little bitty town we lived in way up in the mountains. Drive to Colorado Springs, which is a couple-hour drive, had a neighbor hold me. On the way there, I kept dying on them because I wasn't getting any oxygen in my lungs. And so by the time they got me there, they called the doctor, they met him at the hospital. They laid me on an operating table and ripped me open without any anesthesia because I was dead. And they started to rearrange me, and in the process, there was a lot of damage done to my insides, my lungs. My heart was under my right arm. My stomach was grown to one lung, and one of my kidneys was grown to another lung. And so they did the best they could, and they sewed up the hole. They got everything moved back down, except for one kidney, which they punctured thinking it was a fluid pocket. Put me into shock. Anyway, it was very touch and go. They did not think that I would survive that, but I did. And it's quite a spiritual story. But what ended up happening was 2 months later it broke open again because the sutures just broke open. And so they rushed me back, and again the same trauma going through the situation. And then finally, December of that year of 63, they were in Arizona, and it broke open again. And they rushed me to an emergency room in Phoenix, and lo and behold, there was a surgeon there who was on call, who was one of the surgeons that had just developed a process where they put a Marlex gauze to cover these openings. And so they did surgery on me and put the Marlex gauze in me. And that saved my life. Now, what happened with that, the reason I'm telling you all that, aside from the sympathy I want from you, is there was a couple things that happened at that moment in time that went with me for many years that I struggled with. And the first one was I was a miracle. I had survived the unthinkable at that point in time. And I would like to say at this point in time, I have a belief today about miracles that's probably not real popular. I would be really okay if I never needed another miracle, and here's why. I'm really glad they're there, and I am an absolute believer in them. But the first half of a miracle is traumatic. We don't need miracles if everything's going okay. And I really don't want a lot of trauma in my life anymore. And I've had a lot of miracles in my life, and I'm okay if I've had my share. So anyway, I was a miracle. What that told me growing up was that I was very special, I was different, I was very spiritual. God surely loved me better, and I was going to do great things. Now, the problem was they also diagnosed me as being mentally retarded, which is what they called it back then. Because I lost so much oxygen, they were pretty certain that I wouldn't be real functional. What they told my family was basically if they could get me into regular schools, if I survived past the age of 5, if they get me into regular schools, they'd be lucky. Not to have a lot of, don't push me, just whatever I could accomplish would be great. So I went through the first part of my life believing I was just a lot slower than everybody else. It wasn't necessarily talked about a lot, but I was treated that way. I knew it. Apparently when I was 5 or 6 years old or 8 years old, something, and they went back in and did some reconstructive surgery on me, they discovered that I was not mentally retarded, but nobody told me. Nobody bothered to mention it to me. So the family knew, but I didn't know. So I lived believing that I was on some level of mental retardation up until I went through treatment at 22 years of age. Now, another thing that occurred early on in life was I discovered that I was gay, which is a big no-no in the Christian church. And so here I was, this miracle child that was going to hell. And that was very conflicting for me because I didn't really want to be gay, and I didn't really want to be retarded. So I just sort of felt like I was the butt of a lot of God's jokes. And so it was very confusing, and that followed me throughout time. I've had a wicked sense of humor since I was very young. My mind works very, very fast, and I say things without much of a filter. But I've always sort of been into the shock value of things. And back in the 70s, when I was headed into junior high school, the Equal Rights Amendment was real popular. Remember that? Those of you that are older, the women were looking for equal rights in the business and in voting and so on and so forth. And so a lot of stuff on TV was about the equal rights, and the Brady Bunch addressed it, and different television shows. And one of the things that I got an idea somewhere was that girls were trying out for football and boys were trying out for homecoming queen. Well, we didn't have homecoming queen in 6th grade, but we had cheerleading. So I talked a friend of mine into trying out for cheerleading with me. And we got permission, and it was hysterically funny. I mean, it was just, everyone was on board. It was a hysterically funny moment. But then before this happened, he backed out. He chickened out. So it was just me. Well, I'm not a quitter. So I went out there and had one of my sisters teach me a cheer, and I went out there and did my cheer, and the place erupted, and I was loved. I mean, everyone was like for me, everyone voted for me, and I became a cheerleader. Now, here's the flaw in the plan. I did not want to be a cheerleader. I was not a good cheerleader. And about the last thing I wanted was to be stuck on a bus with a bunch of cheerleaders. So I had decided that I would quit and let one of the girls take over, but my mom informed me that us Tanksleys were not quitters, and that I was not allowed to quit because I had, tried out and made it, and we were going to stick through it to the end because that's what you do. That's how you're healthy. If you commit to something, you show it all the way to the end, right? Well, so I was stuck in 7th grade being a cheerleader. Now, let's all go back to 7th grade for just a minute. We're going through puberty. All the girls were taller than me. I'm gay. I was not good at cheerleading. I could not remember the cheers. I did not want to remember the cheers. I was not an athletic supporter. I knew nothing about football. I knew nothing about basketball. And here I was. And the student body started getting very uncomfortable with me being a cheerleader. And it started out with some of the girls that had not gotten to be cheerleaders because I was. And they started picking on me. And that was okay. I mean, I understood. But then some of the boys got involved, and they became physically aggressive towards me, where I became, I was bullied. I was beaten and spit on and called a lot of really nasty names, and I was stuck. And it was a very, very scary time for me. It was very traumatic. I became, I went from being like an average light kid to being the target of everyone's animosity. This included teachers. This included the business people in town. This included the parents. Anyway, it was an embarrassment. But anyway, I was the target. I made it through 7th grade as a cheerleader, and also at that point in time at home, everything was sort of going haywire. My dad, again, was a very aggressive man, and he got very sick with heart ailment, and life at home became really crazy. He went off the deep end, and my mom was busy trying to keep her sanity, and so I spent most of my time with the inmates that were getting ready to be paroled, and that's where I started smoking cigarettes, and they introduced me to marijuana and some other things I won't go into right here, but it was a whole lot of fun. Anyway, so the only sanity I had really was with these convicted felons, and I felt safe there, of all places. And I wasn't safe at school, and I wasn't safe at home, but I was safe with these young men that were in for, who were they going to judge? I wasn't judging them; they weren't judging me. So it was a reprieve in my insanity. But it was during that time I became very suicidal. I did not want to live. Again, I knew that God was angry with me, and that human beings were crazy, and I couldn't trust them because people that had been my friends had turned against me, and so on and so forth. So I made it through 8th grade and into 9th grade, which was high school, and it became unbearable. So I made a decision that one way or the other I was going to get out of there. It just so happened that my dad ended up having to retire, so we moved to Colorado Springs, and it was there that I started really sort of going off the deep end. I had a lot of frustration, a lot of anger, and a lot of fear. And it wouldn't take a lot to put me into anxiety. It was a sort of a PTSD, I guess, anytime there was violence or whatever around. So I started smoking a lot more weed during that point in time. But I got a job with a man who was really, really good with me. He'd been a teacher, and he sort of understood that my self-esteem was in the gutter. And again, I'm going to remind you, at this point, I still think I'm mentally retarded. I still think I'm not real functional. But he trusted me with things, and it was a little art gallery we worked at, and he would let me hang stuff. He'd let me go shopping and help, buy things, and it was very good. But he also thought I was hysterically funny. He thought I made him laugh a lot because I was so quick. So he decided it'd be really funny to see me get drunk. Now, I had tried alcohol before. I mean, my sister had let us try a beer, and someone else had let us try, I don't know, like a rum and coke. I thought it was a Roman Coke. I spent years chasing a Roman Coke. Anyway, I hated the taste of alcohol. I thought it was just nasty. It wasn't something I liked. And I never drank enough to get a buzz, so it was pointless. It wasn't anything I was attracted to. But he had a son bring some, we were in Colorado Springs at the time, bring some Coors, tall Coors, beer, which I'm certainly not a beer fan, but they were all egging me on. And again, I love attention. I love being the center of attention, and I love the fact that for that moment we were all like on the same page. And so I chugged 3 of those bad boys and just got shit-faced and ended up with a room spinning and the whole 9 yards. And it wasn't particularly pleasant, but for that moment in time, we were connecting. It was just, I felt, a connection. Excuse me. What happened after that was I discovered that if I drank fast enough, I could catch a buzz. That I didn't have to really taste the alcohol if I just drank it really, really fast. So before we moved again, but before that, I would find someone to get me beer, and I could drink really fast and get a buzz, and then suddenly I was smart. And suddenly I was sexy. Yeah. And suddenly I was, brave. And I was all these things, and it was just amazing. It was like a medication. Suddenly I wasn't Roy anymore. I was this character, and it was amazing. And nothing bad happened. I didn't get any trouble drinking. I didn't get any trouble, with any of that stuff. I didn't get caught. I wasn't doing anything I shouldn't be doing, so to speak, except for drinking. But I wasn't out driving or all those other things. Then we moved to Tallahassee, Florida. And I ended up with a best friend who, a straight guy who I absolutely fell madly in love with, who that was never going to work out, but I was determined to do, to hang with him. And he liked to drink and he liked to party. And so he turned me on to the hard liquor. And that's when I fell in love, because I could drink really quick, bourbon or whatever, drink really, really quick. And it tasted to me pretty much the same as anything else. I didn't have to like the taste. I could chase it with something, and I could get buzzed really, really quick. And they put up with me, and I was really funny at that point during my drinking. I was really funny. I would get kind of ballsy and do things. We were in theater together, and we would break into the school and work on the set at night and tell everyone it was the theater ghost. I mean, it was just, we would go into old hotels and break into other people's schools and, just stuff that we shouldn't have been doing. But we weren't destructive, but it was, I would have never done that without, the alcohol. It wouldn't have happened. I managed to graduate from high school somehow. And it was after I graduated from high school, and I got a job working at Crystal's Hamburgers, by the way. That's when my drinking started taking off. I was 18, and I was going to bars at night, and I was able to get away with buying liquor by that point, because I think the drinking age was 19 and I had a fake ID. So I was drinking a little bit more, then I moved out of my parents' house. Oh, it was also during this time I started getting engaged to girls. And let me tell you my reasoning behind it. Now, all the girls I got engaged to knew I was gay. So it wasn't like I was trying to pull the wool over their eyes. But there was two things. One, maybe I would turn straight. Maybe. We could try. And they tried. And maybe, if nothing else, it would be a front for me so other people wouldn't catch on I was gay. Because at that point in time, being gay was illegal. And it was not safe. That was back, and I like to say this, back then sex was safe, but being gay wasn't. Then AIDS hit and everything sort of shifted. So part of my amends process had to be to go back and try to find some of these, and some I haven't found yet. But I would get these girls that became my best friends, and I would get engaged to them, and they would fall madly in love with me, because all the good men are either gay or married. And I treated them well. I mean, I didn't treat them, women tend to be really upset with men, with straight men, because they only want one thing, whatever. All men are assholes, And men say all women are bitches, and it just cracks me up. One more reason I think homosexuality makes sense, but that's neither here nor there. Anyway, so I was getting engaged to these girls and drinking more and more and partying more and more, and then I started trying other drugs too. But it was the drinking that became the stable part of my life, and. Let's see. Somehow or another, I ended up in Kansas. Yeah. And I was, the first time I got really confronted about my drinking, I was in college in Hutchinson, Kansas at Hutch JUCO. And my dorm mother decided that I was drinking too much, and how she arrived at that with everybody else in their drinking, I don't know. But I was drinking hard liquor, and the rest of them were like drinking beer on the weekends. So she pulled me aside and suggested that I needed some help with my drinking. And of course, like the good alcoholic, I said, of course I've got a problem with drinking. I didn't want to get in trouble. So I'm like, sure, I'll do whatever you want, you know. So she took me to church. Now, this was not the first time I had tried to use religion to solve my problems. I had been through church, I had been saved, I'd been given the gift of tongues, I had done all kinds of stuff. Did not fix my drinking, did not fix my being gay. It just gave me more guilt and shame and anger and disappointment. Anyway, so I signed up to go to a counselor there at the college under the guise that we were going to work on my drinking problem. And we went in there for a session, and he asked me about my drinking, and of course I lied. You know, I minimized it. I don't remember how much I said, but it wasn't true. But I knew that if I could get him off subject, that we would work on other issues. So I told him I was gay, and so the rest of the time we were in there, we were working my acceptance. You know, we didn't talk about my drinking one more time. And I got news for you. My drinking and being gay have nothing to do with each other. My alcoholism, you know, I'm not one because of the other. They're two separate things. It's just as the path I'm taking. So, but I learned real early if I use that as a defense, and people would focus on that and leave my drinking alone, because I was going to protect my drinking at all costs. That was my medicine. That was the only thing keeping me sane and probably keeping me alive in my mind, you know. So anyway, we went through, I guess, 3 or 4 months of counseling with him, and he was a good-looking man, so I didn't have any problem going in there. And he seemed very open-minded, but anyway, so the last session, so we'd gone through all this, and we talked about trauma, and we talked about all kinds of stuff. And, you know, psychology says that if you try to figure out the reason you drink, maybe you'll stop. But Alcoholics Anonymous doesn't so much rely on the reason you drink, it's what are you going to do about the drinking? Well, we never got to that. We did all the other reasons, you know, why was I drinking? And so I was a really good, you know, student. Anyway, the last session we had, he said, so we've been through a lot, and you've done really well. He gave me a big old pat on the back. He said, how's the drinking? I said, oh, it's just fine. It's just fine. This has really helped. Thank you so much. You know, basically, I'll go and sin no more, you know, type of deal. Then I was drinking more. I mean, it just, you know, the progression was on. I got out of school, moved to Hays, Kansas, and of all the places to get a job, I started working on a psychiatric unit at night with crazy people. But this was a psychiatric unit that took care of like 7 counties, so we got everything in, including alcoholics and addicts and anorexics and bipolar and schizophrenics and all kinds of stuff. And it just so happened that one of the other people I worked with also drank as much as I did. So we would, you know, get off in the morning and go get drunk together a lot of times. And then that night we'd have contests to see who could throw up the most, and, you know, typical alcoholic weirdness. I always said I never drank in the morning because I never was one to wake up and take a drink. But when I was working nights, I drank every morning, and I was always there at the liquor store when it opened. I was like the first person there. So, you know, they had a clue, but I didn't care at that point. Because, again, at this point in time, my drinking, aside from that one confrontation, confrontation I had with my dorm, nobody had really ever addressed it with me. And then I got a DWI. And I got to tell you, my experience with the DWI was a little different than most people. I was thrilled. And here's why. I was raised with a bunch of convicted felons. They all had street creds. I was going to jail. Yeah, I was going to jail. I liked jail. You know, I felt safe in jail. I felt safe at the prison. Why wouldn't I feel safe at jail? They took me in. I was so pie-eyed when they picked me up. I was drunk. And they took me in, and they sat me down, and I thought it was the funniest thing I'd ever been through, and I was just having fun. And they told me, they wanted me to watch the film of myself, and I wouldn't do it because I knew it'd be embarrassment to myself. But they told me I was one of the happiest drunks they'd ever seen in there. I was thrilled. I was home, you know. So anyway, they put me in the drunk tank and let me sleep it off that night. And the next morning I woke up, and you know what they served me? Over easy eggs. they were looking back at me. I was a bit queasy. Anyway, they took me to court that day, and I think this was on my day off, luckily. Anyway, the judge, I couldn't make heads or tails of what he was saying because I was still so hungover and still drunk. I couldn't make heads or tails, and he was reading off the charges, and I had no idea. And I just looked at him and said, Your Honor, can we please just do this another time? I just can't do this. Well, lo and behold, there's a thing called a continuance, and apparently I asked for one. So they put off my court date till later, and they put me back in the holding cell and gave me some kind of bail, which I had no intention of paying. I was really content being in jail. They had a TV in there. I didn't have a TV at my home, where I was living. They were feeding me. There were men right over here in the other cell. They were playing cards, and we were all, big happy family. And they kept coming up to me and saying, isn't there someone you can call to come? We've talked to the judge, and they're not going to make you pay bail if you can just get someone to sign you out. And I'm like, no, I'm good. I'm fine. I'll stay. And they were getting really frustrated. So I finally got a hold of one of the counselors I worked with who happened to be a cocaine addict. And I knew he'd come sign me out. He did. And I got out of jail. But then the reality of getting arrested hit, and I was going to have to pay money, and I was going to have to go to AA meetings, and I was going to have to go to drunk driving class and all these things. And I started the process, and this is when I was introduced to Alcoholics Anonymous with my little card I had to get signed. I went into an AA meeting. I did not want to be there. I did not identify with any of the people there. I was 22 years old. They were all much older than me. They all seemed like they were in their 80s. That's probably not true. But in my mind, they were a bunch of old people. They all seemed to have been sober since Jesus was making wine out of water. And they were making fun of me. Back in the early 80s, they didn't quite have the patience they do today. I remember one guy saying, I spilt more than you ever drank, and another one called me a young puke. And somehow or another, it seemed ridiculous to me. I wasn't offended. I wasn't mad. I could have just cared less. So I sat through that meeting and got my paper signed. Oh, and it just so happened one of our previous clients was sitting in that meeting too, an alcoholic woman. Thank God it was Alcoholics Anonymous. She kept her mouth shut. But anyway, so I found out that if I would go through treatment, then that would take care of all of my legal issues with the drinking. Now, that doesn't mean that I was going to quit drinking, but if I went through treatment, then it would, all the fines most of the fines would go away, all the stuff would take care of everything, and I had insurance, so it wouldn't cost me a lot to go through treatment. So I went to Valley Hope in Norton, Kansas, and okay, so at this point, I'm going to remind you again, I'm still mentally retarded, okay? Right? I made it through high school without ever studying. I didn't have to try anything because I was not functional, and I was a drunk. So I went through Valley Hope in Norton, Kansas, and being intellectually challenged had always sort of been an excuse for me not to really try anything because I couldn't anyway, right? So why bother? Well, I went in there, and they give you testing when you first go in. And one of them is an IQ test, and it's called the Shipley IQ test. And I had been grading that test for 2 years at my job. And it's basically, you have a word, and then you have 4 other words, and you got to pick the one that's most closely associated. I had the thing memorized. So I got 100% on this IQ test. Well, I'm going to say that I knew that it wasn't going to be right, so I told the people, this isn't going to be right because I've been grading this test. It's going to be a fault. They didn't pass that information along. So I went through treatment with an IQ of like 180. And here I am thinking, I've got maybe like a 90 IQ, and so I have this counselor, and she's so sweet. She's got a year of sobriety. She's very high on AA and all this stuff, and easily manipulated. And so during treatment, I became very spiritual. We had a chaplain, and we had, a little chapel, and we had groups, and I was confronted when I needed to be confrontive, and I was compliant when I needed to be compliant, and I was all these things, and it was just such an utter crock of bullshit. But we manipulate. A lot of people that come into treatment want to sort of ruffle feathers, and I just was the opposite. I just wanted to get out of there with a good grade. I was going to graduate with a good grade. Anyway, she kept giving me all this homework to do. Now, I had a roommate in treatment who was a little scrawny little biker guy who didn't bathe. And I mean, he was like, I don't know what drugs he did, but he was damaged. And so, he was living the life I thought I should be living, because they were really happy if they could get him to read a page out of the big book. And here she was giving me 2 and 3 chapters a night and homework to read, and I was doing it, but I was pissed. I got really mad, so I went in and confronted her. I'm like, why are you picking on me? This bozo that I'm rooming with doesn't have to do anything, and here you are piling on. And that's when she alerted me to the fact that I was brilliant. And we had a discussion. And I said, no, I'm mentally retarded. And she thought I was kidding. And I said, no, I lost all this oxygen in my brain. I've never been functional. I nearly failed out of school. And she said, you're not mentally retarded. I said, yes, I am. And we struggled with this. And so she worked on it. And then she started asking me some questions like, so why did you almost fail out of school? And I said, because I wasn't capable. She goes, well, did you study? I said, no. And she said, did you fail any classes? And I said, no. She says, stupid people don't pass classes without studying. How did you do that? And I went, I don't know. How have you managed to keep a job? How have you filled out a job application? How did you go? I drank my way out of college. It wasn't because I wasn't able to do it, but I was drinking. And so she was giving me all this evidence. I'm like, damn it, I'm not mentally retarded. And it occurred to me that my whole life plan at that point was shattered, because suddenly now I didn't have that excuse, and I was going to have to figure something out. Anyway, I made it through treatment with rave reviews, and I was told if I could just stay sober a year that they would hire me back as a counselor, which really inflated my ego. I was drunk within 60 days of leaving there. I got out of treatment, went back to the psychiatric unit where I was working, got permission from the judge to move. I moved to Mississippi, and within a couple weeks there, I was drinking again, and boy, it was on. Now, when I went into treatment, I knew that I liked to drink, and I drank more than most people, but I didn't really see that as a problem. When I got out of treatment, I didn't think it was that big of a problem. But when I started drinking again, it became very apparent, because I had learned in treatment and with what few AA groups I'd gone to that it was a progressive disease. And so I sort of got enough education about it. And I started drinking, and my world just spun out of control, and I ended up going to Albuquerque. And for the next year and a half, my drinking increased and increased and increased. And I ended up being homeless and living on people's couches. And finally, my sister let me move in with her. And I started shaking really bad. I was having the shakes every day. I was a nursing assistant. I couldn't even sign in at work because I was shaking so bad and I didn't want anyone to see me. I was throwing up all the time, whether I was drinking or not. I would come to a stoplight. I would have to open my door and throw up. And in my mind, it was cancer. I had a tumor, anything but what the cause was. But finally, in November of 1986, I finally knew that I had to quit. I just had to quit. It was really bad. I didn't want to live. I couldn't stop drinking. I was too scared to kill myself. I wasn't holding jobs. I mean, just, you know the story. So I went to AA, and I had a much different experience. And now I don't really know if it was because I was in a different headspace or if it because the group was in a different headspace. But they welcomed me with open arms, and I let them. I didn't go on their defensive. I went in there beaten. I was whooped. I was 23 years old. I'd only been drinking for like 6 years, and I was just at the bottom. And they were people from all walks of life. There were some young people in there that were around my age. There was a couple that were younger. They had people that, were different ages, different occupations, a lot of different spiritual paths. And they just started loving me immediately. And I didn't really register that's what it was, but I just knew that I was safe there for an hour. I was safe there. So I wasn't working during that time, so I was going to like 5 meetings a day because they had them all the time. And I would just show up, and I would stay, and then I would leave, and I would not drink, and I would count the minutes till the next meeting, and I'd go to the next meeting. And then I started sharing, which was probably a shame for them because I wouldn't shut the hell up, and there was an old man that ran the place. He thought he ran the place, and his name was Glenn Floyd, and he had 34 years of sobriety, and he was a cranky old man, and I hated him. I just loathed everything about him, but I was scared to death of him. And one day I walked in, I had maybe a week of sobriety, and I walked in, and he grabs the vacuum cleaner and goes, "Here, vacuum the floor." Okay, asshole. And I got the vacuum cleaner, and I started vacuuming the floor, and I was just livid. It was like he didn't even ask. He just vacuumed the floor. So I vacuumed it, and I put it up. He didn't say thank you. Nobody noticed my vacuuming. I was such a victim. The next day I came in early. Vacuum cleaner is not going to vacuum itself. Fine. Started vacuuming. This went on for a month. And I was so resentful every time I got that vacuum cleaner. I was just... One day I came in and there was a newcomer who had my vacuum cleaner. I was pissed. He had my job, and he wasn't doing it right. Yeah. Glenn finally died, and there was like this sigh of relief when he passed away. He was one of those. I know we're not supposed to talk that way, but there are just some people when they pass away, everyone's just like, "Whew, that drama's over," because he really was kind of a character. Anyway, it got me involved in AA, but I found a loophole in AA, and that's called the Marijuana Maintenance Program. And so after about a month or so of sobriety, I wasn't quite willing to let go of my old playmates and playpens at that point. And so I, on occasion, would smoke weed with them. And, I was asking women to be my sponsors. Now, none of them knew I was gay. I never mentioned it. And these women were like, well, no. They thought I was hitting on them. And so I finally found, I had about 2 months of sobriety, and I finally found a guy who I thought, well, he's a gentle soul. He'll be gentle with me. I need love. I need love. That's what I need. I don't need anyone harsh. So I asked him to be the sponsor, and he had 2 years of sobriety, and he was thrilled. His ego was like, whoosh, yes, I'm going to save me. It was great. Anyway, on my birthday, February 4th of 1987, I went out to eat with these friends of mine, and we smoked some weed, and I hated it. And it was just, I was at the end. I was like, I didn't want to live this way anymore. And so I called him up the next day or the day after that and said, I think I'm ready to quit smoking pot now. And he's like, you're still smoking pot? I'm like, well, yeah. He said, you're going to have to change your sobriety date. And I said, like hell I am. I've got 90 days of sobriety. I'm not going to lose that amount of time. I've worked hard. He said, you are not sober. This is a program of total abstinence. I'm like, that's not what the literature says, buddy. So I was very smart. I went from being retarded to being brilliant. So he suggested that I bring it up in the group. And I did. I brought it up in the group, and they were very uncomfortable with the topic because, we don't talk about anything but alcohol in AA meetings. So they were all very skittish about that topic. But I brought it up, and I said, I I've quit and I don't plan to smoke again, but I do not want to change my sobriety date. And so, there were a few people in the room that had the situation and they had changed their sobriety date, and there were other people that had never done it, but they agreed it was a program of total abstinence and so on and so forth. But there was one guy in the room who smoked pot when it came around. And he was a big advocate for me not giving up my sobriety date. And he would follow me outside of the room with literature and so on and so forth. And I want to thank him, because had it not been for him and how ridiculous he was, I would have never changed my sobriety date. But I did. I changed it. And, the temptation was, well, hell, I've got to change it anyway. I should just drink, but I didn't. So February 5th of 87, I'm going to have to hurry up, I think. I started my clean and sober date. And 24 years old, really got involved in AA. Ended up with a different sponsor. The sponsor I had fired me because I couldn't be honest. Imagine that. I finally got a real temporary, I didn't know she was going to be a temporary sponsor, but someone that I did a really intense fourth and fifth step with. I had done one with this first sponsor, and he gave it an F. He said it wasn't very good. But the one I did that really was healing was a fear inventory, where I was put on the table everything I was scared of. And it was extremely vulnerable. I had never told anyone what I was scared of, because you don't give people that information, because they might use it against you. Anyway, that started the healing process, and I stayed sober. And I worked the steps. I did some of the amends. And I was going to meetings all the time. I got another sponsor, and anyway, I loved AA, and it just absolutely changed my life. I had all my friends were AA members. I got a job in a treatment center, working overnight in the treatment center. Anyway, I ended up moving to Nashville, and then to South Carolina, and I had about 5 years of sobriety when I moved to Nashville, and I ended up going back to Albuquerque at 7 years of sobriety. And up to that point, I'd had a really pretty strong AA program. But when I went back to Albuquerque, I went back to my home group, and everything had changed. And I no longer had I don't know, it was kind of like when I left there, I was the golden child. And when I came back, I was nobody. And my sponsor that I had moved. And anyway, I'm going to tell you ahead of time, that was the beginning of a relapse. It took 3 years. But I stopped working the steps. I didn't bother getting a sponsor. I was going to meetings sporadically. And I just got more and more miserable. I had some friends that had moved to Albuquerque when I had 18 months of sobriety, and they were still there. And his name was Mark, and her name was Rita. And while I was gone, they had a child, and they ended up getting married, and the child's name was Noel. And we were very, very good friends, but then Noel had an accident where he fell and cracked his head open, and it broke up their relationship, and I became friends with them individually. And the reason I'm telling you that is that, so Rita and I were friends over here, and Mark and I were friends over here. And Noel, I was kind of jealous of Noel. I mean, he was a great kid, but I was just really kind of jealous of him. But anyway, on August 30th of 1996, at 1 o'clock in the morning, Noel was staying with Mark, and Mark stabbed him to death with a screwdriver. And I got a call the next day. And I had 9 years of sobriety, and my whole world stopped. It just absolutely stopped. So I went over to Rita's side and told her I would walk through hell with her. It split the AA group in half, because half the people believed he did it and half the people didn't believe he did it, so nobody talked about it. My sponsor had moved. I was trying to be her support system, and I was getting no support anywhere. I went with her through the whole funeral process. They were Jewish, And the Jewish faith buries them the next day. They don't have a viewing. They don't do embalming, anything. But because it was a murder, they had to do an autopsy, and it was Labor Day weekend. So they weren't going to bury him till Tuesday, so they had to embalm, and they'd never seen a dead body. I mean, I went through all this with him. He was 6 years old, getting ready to go into first grade. I went with her to return the clothes, the school clothes that he got. It was just very emotional, tragic time. And somehow or another, my ego was being fed through this. Like, I was really important in this situation. I was on the inside type of thing. And my heart broke for her. I mean, she was just in so much pain. I ended up having to do a deposition about Mark because we've been so close. And because of my deposition, they decided to put me on the stand at the bail hearing to see if he'd get out on bond or bail or whatever it is. And I remember sitting up there looking at him, and he was like an animal. It was just the whole thing was surreal. And I was trying to tell the truth, but I didn't know if I was telling the truth. And I mean, just everything. I can't tell you what happens to your mind when you're in that situation, but nothing seems real. I mean, just it's all surreal. The next day, on the front page of the Albuquerque Journal, they had a story about him, and they had my name next to his, and we met in Alcoholics Anonymous. And I was horrified by that. I don't think anybody else in the world cared, but I was horrified that my anonymity was broken. Shortly after that, at this point in time, I had celebrated 10 years of sobriety, and I was just miserable, absolutely miserable. Rita started smoking weed again, and I started craving marijuana. And I hadn't craved anything in years and years, but I mean, it just got overwhelming. I was going to meetings, and anyway, I went to a festival, and the obsession was just overwhelming. So I got up on this rock and I prayed, God, if you want me to smoke pot, you'll make it happen, because I have no control over this. And not 15 minutes later, I owned a store. 2 of my customers walked up and stuck a lint joint in my mouth, and I inhaled. My name is Bill Clinton. I endorse this message. No. I inhaled, and I kept inhaling that whole weekend. And I knew I was in relapse at that point. I stopped going to AA. My sobriety date ended immediately, but I didn't drink until November 6th of 1996, which would have been 11 years without a drink. I went and got a bottle, and boy, it was on. All those other drugs went away, and the drinking was on. How much time am I going over here? Keep going. Okay. Well, this is the miracle part of the story. I know I've got to get sober here eventually again. But anyway, so I have this store. I'm drinking heavily. This gal arrives in Albuquerque, and she is messed up. I mean, her life is a wreck. She's abandoned 2 children. She's run away to be with the state fair. And she's found my store, and she decides she really likes me. We become party buddies, and I'm sort of like her father mentor in a really sick way, you know. And her MO was to go find a guy and move in with him for a while, and find another guy and move in with him for a while. Well, on one of these move-ins, she got pregnant. And she came into my store, and she's like, I don't know what to do. I'm pregnant, and I don't want this child. And I'm like, well, are you going to have an abortion? And she's like, no, I am totally opposed to abortion. And I said, well, then I guess adoption. And she said, well, I went by there, and they're going to drug test me, and I'm not going to quit smoking weed. And I said, well, if all else fails and this baby's not totally messed up, I'll take it. Right? I said, I'm not going to have a child this lifetime anyway. I'll take it. Now, I had offered this to women who'd gotten pregnant before because it sort of gave them a chance to breathe, like if all else fails. But nobody took me serious until her. I got news for you people. I was not prepared to have a child. All of my friends were telling me what a stupid idea it was. But on November 2nd of 1998, my son was born. Now, he's not mine biologically, but I went on the birth certificate as a father. He was born in Las Vegas, Nevada. I took him home. I'm also going to say here, I have never had a partner, So I have raised a child all by myself, and the first 4 years of his life I was drinking. And it was one of those things where, it was a God thing in a really weird way. I ended up losing my store and my apartment, and we were sleeping on people's couches, and I got really sick, and that's how I ended up in Arkansas. My parents lived here, and it was a lower elevation because of the lung thing. Anyway, when he was 4 years old, I was in Cherokee Village, and I was sick and tired of being sick and tired, and I couldn't quit drinking. And I went back to AA, and I got permission from the group to bring him with me. So for the first 4 or 5 years of his life, he attended a whole bunch of AA meetings, and I can tell you that scared the shit out of him. He has never had a drink. Anyway, I'll update you. He's 20 years old. He still lives with me, but he's going to ASU, and he's a music major. And just to calm your fears, he's totally heterosexual. And, he's almost a redneck. Almost. I've tried everything I can to divert him from that, but he's almost a redneck. They're going to go against their parents. Anyway, he's a good kid. He's a really good kid. Anyway, I got sober in Cherokee Village, and a month after I got sober, I started to college just to see if I could do it. And I got an associate degree, and then I found out that there was a university in Jonesboro. And so I went to the University of Jonesboro and got a bachelor's degree in journalism, public relations, and I hated it. My minor was English, so I got a master's in English. So for the first 7 years of my sobriety, I was in school. And I ended up teaching at ASU. So I've often kidded and said I'm the only mentally retarded professor there. And it was quite an interesting time doing that. I loved the teaching part. The rest of it, grading papers and all, sucked. But I really loved the teaching part. I loved challenging people. Anyway, a year and a half ago, that ended. That just came to an end. I was an adjunct, and it just came to an end. So I'd been working over the summers at a treatment center, and I got a job as an administrative assistant in the treatment center. I really don't want to be a drug and alcohol counselor. I'm afraid I wouldn't be very good for business. My tendency is to, when people start blowing smoke up my butt, to tell them, there's the door, and you can't do that in a treatment center because they're real sick. And I probably have ruined some people's chance of getting sober because of my attitude. But anyway, I'm still there, and I've got 16 years of sobriety. And there's one other thing I want to leave you all with. I had thought that the theme, I read it wrong. I thought the theme here was came to believe. And I was thinking on the way over here, what have I come to believe since I've been in Alcoholics Anonymous? And I've come to believe that I'm an alcoholic, obviously, and stuff. But I also, where I come from, I do believe that I am a precious child of God, and I have a right to be here. But I also believe you're a precious child of God, and you have a right to be here. And some days that's much harder for me to swallow. I've also discovered that God is not human, and humans are not God. So I have to take that into account when dealing with them. There have been a lot of people try to condemn me to hell and different things, and it's not their job, not any of my business what they think. The one constant thing in life is change, and most of us alcoholics hate change, and I have to work every day on being flexible, which is really not easy for me. But the final thing, and probably the most important thing I learned, is that AA works under all conditions and in all situations. And I am so thrilled to be here, and thank you so much. Well, my name is Roy. I am an alcoholic. My sobriety date is July 8th of 2003. And I'm going to tell you, so you don't have to do the math, that's 16 years and 2 months. And the reason I say that is because when other people get their